Located just outside of D.C., today's park was home to several battles during the Civil War. Its proximity between Washington, D.C. and Richmond, Virginia, made it a prime spot for the North and South to clash. With beautiful battlefields and a lot of history, it's a great stop for our journey. Let's explore Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. I'm your host, Missy Rentz, and this is the Parks Podcast. In today's episode of the Parks Podcast, I'm thrilled to welcome Mary O'Neill. Mary is a park ranger at Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park and has worked for the National Park Service since 2015. Are you ready for this list? At Independence National Historical Park, Death Valley National Park, Saugus Ironworks National Historical Site, Joshua Tree National Park, Cockery National Historic Park, Shenandoah National Park, Women's Rights National Historical Park. Mary, welcome to the Parks Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
We're thrilled to have you, and I can't wait to have this conversation. To kick it off, let me go through some park stats. Correct me if I'm wrong on any of these. The park is located in Spotsylvania County and Fredericksburg, Virginia. It was created on February 14th, 1927. Calvin Coolidge was president at the time. The park is 8,374 acres, and in 2022, there were 756,296 guests. The park contains more than 35 miles of hiking trails. There were 4 battles that took place in Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, the Wilderness, and Spotsylvania, which make up the park. And I think this is fascinating. It is the longest name of any unit in the National Park System at 75 letters.
Yes. And we usually say Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park. That's the shortened version. Our full name is Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania County Battlefields Memorial National Military Park. It's actually too long to write on most publications, so we sort of shorten it. And the only slight addition I'll actually make to those stats, not to leave out our other counties, the bulk of the battlefield of the park is in Spotsylvania County and the city of Fredericksburg, though we do have a few sites that are in Orange County and Caroline County, and parts of Chatham are in Fredericksburg, but closer to Stafford County. We encompass a large swath of land, many jurisdictions kind of are our neighbors, but all tied together with the history of the battles during the Civil War, both before and after, and the impact that those events had on this landscape.
I think that's one of the things that is so fascinating when I went to visit the first time is how many different spots you have, all completely drivable, completely manageable if you wanted to do it in a very busy one day or spread it out. But it is unique in that way, and there is a lot to see. So to kick it off, can you tell me a little bit about the park and why it was so important to add this to the National Park System back in 1927?
Yeah. So you mentioned, we were added to the Park Service in 1927, and there's a fascinating history of the development of the park and really the development of the protection of these spaces that ties into really some big questions, regarding how we remember the Civil War, how we commemorate the Civil War. The first, really, you would say the first plot of land, the first preservation, the first memorialization of the battlefields here by the federal government happens right after the war with the establishment of the Fredericksburg National Cemetery. So the Fredericksburg National Cemetery is established with the help of the National Cemetery Administration, was brand new after the Civil War, is trying to resolve this question of what to do with the bodies, what to do with the remains, the humans who died fighting for the United States. How do we remember them? And we can't possibly identify them all. We can't possibly bring them all home. So they start establishing these cemeteries, the Fredericksburg National Cemetery, even though there's 4 different battles, distinct battles that the park preserves, they take place at different times. The National Cemetery, they started reinterring graves, burials of United States soldiers from the Battle of Fredericksburg, from the Battle of Chancellorsville, from the Wilderness, and from Spotsylvania Courthouse to this one location. At first, that was the location where we memorialized the Civil War. Now, you also have, in the years after the war, you have a variety of other groups doing similar work for Confederate soldiers. There's ladies' memorial associations who are doing similar work, reinterring soldiers. And then you also have people building independent monuments, things like the Sedgwick Monument in Spotsylvania, the Jackson Monument in Chancellorsville. You have this kind of scattering of memorializations happening. It wasn't funded by the federal government, and it wasn't really organized. It was very grassroots. And slowly, as years go by, there's movements to protect the battlefields proper. So that takes a variety of different forms within the federal government from kind of a top level. We were not one of the first battlefield parks protected. There's a few that were before us. I don't want to start listing them in the wrong order, but you've got like Gettysburg and Antietam and I believe, oh boy, I'm going to totally get them wrong. I think Vicksburg and Shiloh and Chattanooga. I think those were the 5, but don't quote me on that. But you have this kind of smattering of some battlefields being preserved. And at the time, at the federal level, and when we were even established, we were part of the Department of Defense. We were protected and managed by the military. When the federal government took charge of some of these early battlefields, in part was to protect the places. The places that I just listed, those are the battlefields that have like a ton of monuments and a ton of memorialization, and they would host these big veteran reunions, places like Gettysburg. We look nothing like Gettysburg, right? You go to Gettysburg, you see a million monuments. It's a very different history. But we were both established to be military training grounds for the most part. So like some of the early park history, it's a dual purpose. It's for veterans of the Civil War to remember the conflict, to remember their comrades, to provide space for veterans to meet. But it was also run by the military as like training. Now, we get transferred to the Park Service a little bit later. So the founding mission of the park is its commemoration, its memorialization. These are things that are kind of hot topics in terms of the development of Civil War history. For us, we do very much have a heavy kind of lost cause legacy, and that we are sort of constantly trying to ourselves confront and also understand so that we can better interpret our spaces in a way that is really honest and up to date and fair to the public right now. I mean, the founding of our park is the complicated story because you have all of these different grassroots organizations that are doing it. The folks who established things like the Jackson Monument, they want a very specific story about Stonewall Jackson to be told in the park. The Stonewall Jackson death site, that's also part of our park. The Park Service doesn't have many locations dedicated to individual like generals who died in the Civil War. Lots of people died in the Civil War. This space is very unique. There's a separate history that we could discuss that is just the history of the preservation of that one building, right? And that one space. A lot of the park, you're dealing with places that were slave plantations, places that have long histories of enslavement. We're dealing with places that have long histories of violence, both before the war and, of course, the war itself is an incredibly violent time.
I find that having read quite a bit about it, having been there, having gone through ranger programs, videos, I feel like it is a very factual portrayal, not highly emotional on either side, which I really appreciated. And it challenged me and my own thinking to open me up to other perspectives, which I really valued. A couple things from that wonderful description. First, the cemeteries. One thing that I thought was interesting is it might have been in the video at the visitor center that the cemeteries and the burials were not just north or south, that they buried all of those who had died and were just kind of left in the streets and in the fields. It was kind of beautiful to me that in the end, they took care of their own and the opposite, no matter what side they were from.
Yeah, and I think that's true in terms of after the battles. Usually, in like a Civil War battle, whoever holds the field at the end of the day is the one who buries. So I think that's probably where what you were at the Fredericksburg Battlefield Visitor Center. So once the U.S. Army retreats back across the river, um, the Confederate troops are left to kind of deal with the burials. It's usually done very, very quickly, very sort of haphazardly at the Battle of Fredericksburg. I mean, it's winter time, like it's not a great time to be burying people for logistical purposes. There was, I think, general sense that you don't want to necessarily disrespect the dead. That being said, like the Fredericksburg National Cemetery is entirely United States soldiers. So there are no Confederate buried in the Fredericksburg National Cemetery. So when the US government decides to establish these national cemeteries, you have to kind of get yourself in the mind of how someone from the federal government or a US soldier might feel immediately after this conflict. They're establishing these official military cemeteries for their comrades. They very much, from Union soldiers' perspectives, very much view Confederate soldiers as traitors. They did not want to have Confederate soldiers in that cemetery. So that's how the Confederate cemeteries, you have different organizations, since the federal government was not going to manage the burial of Confederate soldiers. You have these separate organizations like ladies' memorial associations, and it's a local group, mostly women, who sort of take up the mantle of burying Confederate dead. So they manage the reinterment of the Confederate soldiers into two Confederate cemeteries nearby us. One is in the city of Fredericksburg, another is in Spotsylvania.
So I was lucky enough to go on a ranger tour. I highly recommend it, if for no other reason, to have a ranger paint a picture for what life was like then. Because right now, particularly the Fredericksburg battlefield, it's the suburb of Washington, D.C. If you go there by yourself, it's not like soldiers were hiding behind the 7-Eleven down the street. It was a very different landscape at the time. You can't necessarily paint that picture of being able to see how vulnerable the US soldiers were as they were coming up the hill from the river, first trying to cross the river, but then coming up the hill from the river when the Confederates were just kind of sitting at the top of the hill with free aim.
Yeah, no, the landscape has changed so much. And yeah, today Fredericksburg has a huge commuter population. There's probably some debate amongst people from Fredericksburg whether they consider themselves a suburb of DC or not. I
Point
think
well
there's
taken.
a lot of
Yes.
people who will say, no, we are Fredericksburg, right?
Yes, yes.
The reality of the area is that there's a lot of commuters, there's a lot of development, and it can be really hard to visualize the battlefields because there is a lot of development around the battlefields. Actually, going back a little bit to the way that we were founded, when they established the park, they established it they used something they called the Antietam Plan. And essentially, they started preserving and trying to get these sort of key locations in the battlefield under federal control, and access to a lot of the roads. But they didn't initially make an attempt to get the entirety of the battlefield, all of the land over which these armies fought. What happened was at the time, most of that land was like farmland. Most of that land was not super developed. So our boundary, our official boundary kind of shows this. And over the years, the development in the area happens so very quickly that the park really just couldn't keep up. So what you have today is you have key locations in the battlefields protected, but there are, yeah, huge swaths of area that were technically battlefield, but they're not part of the park. It's one of the things that today we work on is trying to paint that picture. What would it have been like for the soldiers at the Fredericksburg Visitor Center? Right now, you look towards the river and it's a lot of houses. That was a large cleared area. That was the fairgrounds. Now, one of the unique things about the Battle of Fredericksburg is that there was street fighting. There was some kind of early form of like urban combat that was not typical in the Civil War. These armies, these soldiers were not necessarily trained or always expecting to fight in an urban context, although that's what happened. So the US Army arrives across the river in November. They have to wait for pontoon bridges. There's a whole mix up and controversy about missing pontoon bridges. They finally get them. But by the time the army is ready to move, the Army of the Potomac is ready to move, the Confederate Army has just set up on the hills outside of Fredericksburg. And it's winter, and Ambrose Burnside, the commander of the US Army of the Potomac, just decides to go, decides, I'm going to make this attempt, and turns out to be a very lopsided defeat for the US Army. It's demoralizing. The soldiers are largely asking themselves, why are we doing this? Why on earth? How did they think that this was going to work? Now, the actual command decisions are very complicated and always very nuanced. But the Battle of Fredericksburg is a fascinating battle because it takes place at this moment in the war where the war is shifting a lot. On January 1st, 1863 is the Emancipation Proclamation. So just a few weeks after this battle, the US government, even though it has done so poorly in this battle, and Lincoln certainly would have preferred to have some better PR in terms of how the war was going, on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln decides to move forward with the policy of officially making emancipation a war aim and approving the enlistment of Black soldiers. And that happens right around this battle. And then when we go to Chancellorsville, which is just a few months later, you have the Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, two battles that kind of bookend either side of the kind of shifting policy. So one of the things that's really interesting about our battlefields, most battlefields are one battlefield. We have 4 battlefields, and that's fascinating because most battlefields, you're just in one place. You maybe talk a little bit about the context before that point in time, a little bit about the context after that point in time, and then you're done, right? Our battlefields cover this really giant chunk of the war.
So Fredericksburg starts December 11th, 1862. Spotsylvania ends May 21st, 1864. So it's a long time. Then Chancellorsville and the Wilderness were in between those, but that's a long time in a fairly compact space. They're just different areas.
And it's the area, we're halfway between Washington, D.C. and Richmond. So why are all these battles here? Why did the armies never leave this area?
Yeah.
It's just because of the location. We're between these two capitals. There's a river right here. There's a natural barrier. And both armies are heavily invested in protecting their capital. That's why we're here.
If you spend any time in this area, it's unique because there are a lot of places that are not part of the park, but are historic buildings from that era. I found that really amazing. And one of the things I loved visiting Chatham Manor. Chatham Manor is, to set the stage, is on the opposite side of the river of the Fredericksburg battlefield. It has this amazing view. It's like a castle on a hill. It's so beautiful. And during the war, it became a Union hospital and headquarters for the Union Army, but it stayed private for a long time. It wasn't until 1975, more than 50 years after the creation of the park, that it was willed to the National Park Service. So can you tell me a little bit about how this park, but parks in general, can evolve over time with these donations?
It's a complicated process that involves things like legislation and congressional boundaries, something actually to look at. And you'll see it on, if you look at our park map, there's a little key at the side, and the dark green area is the park property, is the boundary of the park. But then you see these other areas, there's a light green and a very light blue. So you've got areas that are congressional, like an authorized boundary. So that's areas that the park is authorized to acquire. Now, I should note, we cannot acquire land outside of that authorized boundary. So if you have private property and you would like the park to have it, you actually can't just donate it to the park. There's a lot of laws. That other color that you see on our map, and it's labeled scenic easements. So those are like agreements with neighbors that certain types of development won't happen. So Chatham was donated to the park. And when the park was first established, I mentioned we only have like a fraction of the story. The park had the cemetery, the park acquires slowly land along like the Sunken Road, what is now along Lee Drive. It's this kind of piecemeal thing. And you can look at early maps of the park and see where a boundary initially were. Over time, it expands. Chatham, we were lucky to get that land, and there was interest in that in part because for interpretively, the park didn't own any land over where the US Army came from. The park's initial land acquisitions were heavily Confederate in terms of the lines of battle that the park had. That actually influences things like the driving tours of the park. You can kind of see it in the way that the driving tours are set up, where they tend to follow the Confederate battle lines more than the US battle lines. It was private organizations initially, largely, and a lot of local folks who were managing that early development of the park. But yeah, it's an interesting process. I think the idea for, especially for people who aren't familiar with a lot of the Park Service, sometimes there's an idea that we can just do whatever, and we can't. We're established by Congress. We have all types of like enabling legislation in our enabling legislation guides what we do, and those things can be adapted and updated. There have been boundary changes. One of those boundary changes in the park was accompanied by an update to some of our enabling legislation, and that happened. They expanded our purpose to include discussions of the context of the Civil War.
Okay.
Again, it kind of sounds like bureaucratic, but that's a really exciting shift, because talking about the context of the Civil War happens largely because of conflict over the institution of slavery. It's central to the war for many, many years, though. A lot of our battlefield and many battlefields would just talk about the movements and soldiers and tactics of that specific battle, not necessarily why the fighting happened in the first place. We had an update to our enabling legislation that included, we are going to discuss the wider context of the war, its impact on civilians. It's kind of exciting. Things can happen positively, but it takes time. It's slow.
Yeah, of course. So, okay, this park, these locations have a lot. They have the battlefields. Some of them are fields. Some of them are in the city, or, somewhat like that. There's houses. I mentioned the one mansion, but there's other houses. There's frames where houses were. There's the cemetery. I can go on and on. So if you're new and you're going, I'm going to go, how do people know where to start?
That's a great question. When I first got a job at this park, I didn't know much about it. And I had kind of a similar conundrum. I was like, how do we do this? There's a lot here. It's not like one chunk of land. Looking at a map of the park, you'll see there's 4 main areas. Fredericksburg, which manages land related to and heavily involved in the Battle of Fredericksburg, which happened in December 1862. Then we have the Chancellorsville battlefield. That's the Battle of Chancellorsville. That happens in May of 1863. So just a few months after Fredericksburg. Chancellorsville is located 10 miles west of Fredericksburg. Then historically, both armies, actually, this is Gettysburg is 2 months after Chancellorsville. So there's kind of this break. Both armies are away. They come back over the winter. So then you have the Battle of the Wilderness. The Wilderness battlefield is located a little bit to the west of Chancellorsville. And then you have the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. The Spotsylvania battlefield is located a little bit south of the Wilderness. Those two are sort of connected in time. That's Grant's Overland Campaign, which starts in the spring of 1864. That's the beginning of the U.S. Army moving south, which ends ultimately, it stalled at Petersburg. And the following year, when the armies break through Petersburg, Appomattox is right after that.
Okay.
That's kind of the big history. Now, we also have those 4 battlefields. We also have historical sites. So Chatham, which is part of Fredericksburg, but it has a wide history of its own. Chatham was a slave plantation for many, many years before the war, has a really interesting post-war history with the sort of restoration of the house in the 1920s. Then we have the Jackson Death Site, which is the building, which was once part of a larger slave plantation, but it's just the farm office, which is the building where Stonewall Jackson died. We also have a few other buildings. Salem Church is not open very much. Salem Church has a history that is connected with both the battles of Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville. There's fighting at Salem Church during the Chancellorsville campaign. So all these places, and Elwood, I can't forget Elwood. Elwood, another slave plantation on the Wilderness battlefields. So how do you visit these places? I would suggest for anyone starting, one is like, don't get overwhelmed. I know it looks like a lot and you might not know where to go. I would start at one of the 2 visitor centers. We have a visitor center at Fredericksburg and a visitor center at Chancellorsville. Both of those visitor centers have a lot of orientation information. We have park movies. Most critically for people visiting, we have our staff. We have park rangers present who can provide guidance and maps and answer questions and are really valuable resources about all of the history. So let's start at one of those 2 places. During the summer, a lot of our buildings are open. Sometimes the hours slow down in the winter, though we try to keep Chatham open as much as possible. During the summer, Elwood is open every day, where we interpret the Battle of the Wilderness and also the history of that space. The Stonewall Jackson Death Site is open on weekends right now. And we also have staff out at the Spotsylvania battlefield on weekends. You have a lot of ways to visit. If you do look at that park map, you'll see these little numbers. There's sets of numbers on each of the battlefields. Those are driving tours. So we are set up to accommodate driving tours for each battlefield. Usually it takes people like an hour and a half-ish to do a driving tour, just one. That could be a little faster if you're just kind of going through, stopping for a second. Sometimes it could be much, much longer if you also want to include doing a hike there or going a little bit more in depth. You can do all 4 battles in one day. It's not impossible. It is difficult and it's a lot to handle. I tend to tell people that we don't want you to fill up your history cup so much you just can't take it anymore. I always prefer to do 1 or 2 things because then you can really absorb it.
Yeah.
And we're dealing with war, we're dealing with death. These are heavy topics that we ask people to think about. And I think give yourself a little grace to take some of that in. By the Fredericksburg Visitor Center, there's the Sunken Road. There's a walking trail that's about a half mile that actually covers a decent amount of history. There's a lot of interpretive signage up there. You get to walk along the road, which was part of the Confederate line. You get to go up Marie's Heights, which is the hill you're looking out to the city of Fredericksburg, and through the Fredericksburg National Cemetery is right up there as well. So that's a good space that's concentrated in terms of visiting somewhere. Chatham is on the driving tour for Fredericksburg. Chatham's number 2. You mentioned if you're thinking about the history of the battle, it's great to get to that other side of the river because then you get to see the city.
2 of the things I really appreciated is that the website has so much information. So I could do a lot of my pre-video watching and things like that on the website. It was part of my planning. and then I could see things and not necessarily stay for the video. The other is the fact that there are driving tours and they're so well curated. Times like now, we're doing this interview in July. It's hot. And so my approach was a morning. I spent the morning, and then once it got hot, I used the car a little bit just to stay cool. And so I do think there's a lot of diversity and the accessibility at the parks. And I really appreciate that. And I think that is a unique feature of these parks. The other thing I think is so interesting is because of their proximity in more urban areas now, they didn't used to be like that even 20 years ago. It wasn't like it is now, but the community embraces the park. And so you see people running, people walking their dogs, going for bike rides along the roads. And so these parks are really part of the communities that they're in.
Yeah, it absolutely is. That's one of the special things about this park. We have people who use the park every day. Our community is largely very supportive of the park. And especially with a lot of development in the area, we are green space. We are a place where people can go and take a walk and get fresh air. There's a group of people that I see every day, and I know their faces, and we say hi, and I know their dogs' names. That's really great that there is a lot of support for the park in the community. It translates to people who take walks in the park. I'll see those same faces sometimes at our special history programs, where there are people who show up for us and are really invested in keeping this space protected and preserved and protecting our resources too.
When I made my list of the different activities I wanted to make sure we've hit on all of them except for one that was intriguing to me. I read a little bit about the National Cemetery luminaries. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so the Luminaria is an annual event at the Fredericksburg National Cemetery. It's by far the largest event that happens at the park every year. It's actually local Boy Scouts who do a huge portion of the work. It's the Saturday of Memorial Day weekend. The Boy Scouts set out a candle for each burial in the National Cemetery. And I should note, a lot of the graves are unknown, and some of the graves, there's more than one person buried in them. There's over 15,000 burials in that cemetery. So they set up over 15,000 candles. It's the one night of the year the cemetery is open after hours, so people can come the Saturday of Memorial Day weekend and come and honor the people who fought and died and who are buried in that cemetery.
It sounds beautiful. It really sounds like an amazing event.
It is really beautiful. The past few years, what we've done is we've set up stations within the cemetery for our interpretive staff. Will be scattered throughout the cemetery during the evening, and you can come up to the different stations and we'll share stories of graves of usually a soldier who's near there. And then they also play taps every half hour during that event. It's a very special event. We have thousands of people show up. And it is one of those events where we see the whole community.
That's wonderful. Okay, so we've talked, you can hike, you can bike, you can do exhibit tours, you can go on ranger talks and battle talks and driving tours, walking tours, and the luminaries. It's a great park. I have driven by it a million times and was so thrilled to finally get to spend a lot of time at it. Actually, as a kid, we used to do the hikes, and little did I know that till I got there. And it was familiar to me. The other thing I want to say is that this is a park, because of its proximity so close to Interstate 95. This is a great spot for destination for sure, but also a very easy spot for I need a pit stop on a road trip. You can do a lot. I loved your point of digest one or two things. You could come very easily and spend 30 minutes or 30 hours in the park. And so it's a beautiful park. Mary, what else does the audience need to know in planning a trip to the park?
Yeah, some kind of logistical things. Our park grounds are open sunrise to sunset every day. So even Christmas, New Year's Day, when the visitor centers are closed, our grounds are always open sunrise to sunset. You're welcome to come for hiking. If you wanted to bring our four-legged friends, dogs are welcome in the park. The only place where they're not welcome is in the grounds of the Fredericksburg National Cemetery. And then, of course, inside park buildings. those service animals are allowed in park buildings. We do have a variety of parking areas available at the visitor centers. And then also on that park map, if you look at the driving tour stops, those stops all have pullouts and parking available so that you can park and walk around and get a sense of the space. The Elwood grounds are kind of interesting. There is a gate at Elwood, which is open when the building is open, but when the building is closed, the grounds are still open. You're allowed to go back there. There's a pullout outside of the gate, so you just have to walk to the grounds. Something also to mention, we do have those two visitor centers. The Chancellorsville Battlefield Visitor Center has exhibits about the battles of Chancellorsville, Wilderness, and Spotsylvania. The Wilderness and Spotsylvania battlefields do not have visitor centers there. They have these exhibit shelters, so they're open air pavilions that have signage and exhibits and battle maps and information about the battlefield, but there's no actual established visitor center, contact center at those spaces. But there's lots of hiking trails available. There's the driving tours. So if you're the type of person who wants to go see exhibits or who wants to watch the park film inside, we do have them online too. But if you want to do that inside, Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, Chatham have those things available. Wilderness and Spotsylvania, you are really more on your own, though we do have those driving tours available on the National Park Service app and on the website, and that can be a good guide.
As we wrap things up, I'm going to give you a speed round of questions.
Yeah.
Just answer the first thing that comes to mind.
Okay.
Okay. What is your earliest park memory?
Earliest park memory is when I was in kindergarten. I lived in Philadelphia and we took a field trip to the Liberty Bell.
How special that you then worked there.
I know.
Wow. What made you love the parks?
I think I love the natural spaces and I love history, and the fact that we do both of those things is just very special to me.
What is your favorite thing about Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park?
Oh man, that's so hard. My favorite thing would have to be taking a walk on the battlefield towards sunset when it's one of those places where it's nice and quiet, and just being able to absorb the history.
What park have you yet to visit but is on your bucket list, and why?
Oh, there's so many. I haven't been to a lot of the northwest corridor of the country. So anywhere up in there, like Olympic or some of the historical sites up there, I really haven't explored a lot of that part of the country.
What are 3 must-haves you pack for a park visit?
I'm going to be really boring here and say water and food, because those are critical. And for me, I like to bring my sketchbook. I like to draw, and I always like to have my sketchbook with me just in case.
What is your favorite campfire activity?
S'mores.
Tent, camper, or cabin?
Tent.
Hiking with or without trekking poles?
I usually go without, but I should probably use them.
What is your favorite trail snack?
Little oranges.
What is the best animal sighting that you've had?
Best animal sighting. Probably the one I was most excited for was when I was at Joshua Tree. I had been looking out for a desert tortoise for the longest time, and when I finally found one, I was just over the moon.
What is your favorite sound in the park?
This is kind of a strange answer. I like hearing, especially towards the evening, you get this influx of animal noises. I think frogs are really cool. I like hearing frogs. I don't know why. I think they're fun.
Mary, thank you so much for joining us on the Parks podcast. This has been a really wonderful conversation.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
That's it for today's episode. Join us next time. And until then, we'll see you in the parks. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to like and share on your favorite podcast platform. Music for the Parks podcast is written, performed, and produced by Porter Hardy. For more information, please follow us on Instagram at The Parks Podcast or visit our website at theparkspodcast.com.